The cold finds you before the light does. It seeps through the thatch, through the wool blanket, through the coarse linen pressed against your skin, and it settles into the joints of your hands like something permanent. The air smells of damp straw and ash and the particular rot that would develops when it never quite dries out. You lie there for one moment, just one, before the day begins its demands. And in medieval England, the day always demands everything. You're not a queen. You're not a saint. Not the ethereal figure frozen in stained glass with her eyes cast humbly toward heaven. You are one of the thousands, hundreds of thousands, of women whose names were never written down, whose faces were never painted, whose stories were considered too unremarkable to preserve. History looked at your life and saw nothing worth recording. It looked at the suffering, the labor, the astonishing ingenuity, and it called it ordinary. This is the story it never told. Your world is small and physical and relentlessly immediate. You know every face on your street, every weakness, and every surplus in your neighborhood. You know who is 3 days from hunger and who quietly left bread at their neighbor's door. You carry water from the well in the gray morning chill, your breath fogging the air, your cracked hands tightening around the bucket handle. The work begins before the light is fully up, and it does not stop until the fire dies and the children are quiet, and you finally allow your body to collapse onto that damp straw again. There is no gap between your life and your labor. They're the same thing. If you were the wife of a craftsman in one of England's market towns, you work beside him in the shop, dyeing cloth, stitching leather, measuring grain, keeping accounts he could not keep without you. You have learned the trade, not because anyone sat you down to teach it, but because necessity is the only education available to you. If you're a villager, your days follow the agricultural seasons with a brutality that has no sympathy for grief or illness or the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying a child in your body while still turning soil with a wooden-handled tool that give your palms blisters before noon. You do not stop because you cannot stop. This relentless, unrecorded, uncompensated labor, performed every single day for your entire adult life, is the first truth that history never bothered to mention. Now let us talk about what the law thinks of you. Not what your neighbors think, not what the priest thinks. What the law, the actual legal structure of medieval England, says about your existence. The answer is almost nothing, and what it does say is devastating. Under the doctrine of coverture, which shaped English common law from at least the 12th century onward, your legal identity vanished entirely upon marriage. You ceased to exist as an independent person before the courts. Your husband held all property, including whatever you brought into the marriage. Any wages you earned, any goods you sold to the market, any money you saved from months of work, all of it flowed directly to him, automatically, without discussion. You could not sue in a court of law. You could not sign a contract. You could not own land in your own name. If your husband beat you, and the law did permit what it calmly described as a degree of reasonable chastisement, your options were suffocatingly limited. A sympathetic priest might intervene. A neighbor might intervene. The law looked somewhere else. The cruelty buried inside this arrangement is not simply that you had no rights. It is that you were expected to carry full economic responsibility while holding none of the legal protections that responsibility should have warranted. You managed the household finances, traded at market, preserved and stored and rationed food across the long winters, made the difference between a family that survived and a family that did not. And yet the moment any of that effort produced real value, it belonged to someone else. You were essential to the economy and invisible to the law at the same time, and the system had been designed with remarkable precision to keep it that way. If you were a widow or a woman who had never married, what the law called a femme sole, you had more standing. You could trade, contract, be held liable. But do not mistake that for freedom. Society watched unmarried women with a suspicion that sat just below hostility. The church's language around female independence was unambiguous and brutal. Women were daughters of Eve, inherently disordered, naturally prone to chaos unless governed by a father, a husband, or a convent wall. A woman living alone and trading on her own account was, in the eyes of many around her, only a few careful steps from something scandalous. Your respectability was not merely a social nicety. It was your only armor. Lose it through rumor, through a misunderstood association, through the wrong kind of talk, and you lost everything else along with it. Let us be direct about your body now, because this is where the darkness becomes impossible to romanticize. Childbirth in medieval England was the single most lethal event in a woman's life. Not occasionally, consistently, and with a grim regularity that everyone around you understood perfectly well. Historians estimate somewhere between 1% and 5% of all births ended in the mother's death. Figures that sound almost manageable until you understand that most women who reach adulthood would carry and deliver multiple children, often 5, 6, 7, or more, and that each pregnancy reset the risk entirely. By your mid-30s, if you had survived 6 deliveries, you had faced that mortality threshold 6 separate times. The cumulative probability is not something you want to calculate on a quiet evening. You gave birth without anesthesia, without sterile instruments, without any medical understanding of infection. The women gathered around you, your mother, your neighbors, the midwife who arrived carrying her bag of herbs and her accumulated knowledge, did everything within their considerable power. And that knowledge was real. Midwives in medieval England held generations of empirical wisdom. Which herbs could slow hemorrhage, which positions reduced obstruction, which signs in a laboring woman's face meant the worst was arriving. This was not superstition. It was sophisticated, carefully tested medical knowledge, accumulated over centuries and passed from woman to woman because no one else was doing the passing. But it had its absolute limits. When a birth went wrong, it went catastrophically and swiftly wrong. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, could kill a woman within 3 days of a successful delivery, and neither she nor anyone attending her had any way of understanding why the fever came or how to stop it. 3 hours after you deliver your child, you're already moving. Not because anyone forces you with words, because the fire is dying and the bread needs attention and the other children are hungry and the animals need feeding and there's simply no one else. Your body, torn, bleeding, running on nothing, continues because it has no choice but to continue. You do not have a word for what this is doing to you. You have no framework for rest as a right. You endure it as your mother endured it, as her mother endured it, as generations of women endured it before you, all the way back into a past so distant it has no edges, and none of them were recorded because suffering this ordinary was not considered news. Here is the revelation that almost no account of medieval women includes, because it requires looking not just at individual lives, but at the pattern underneath them. Medieval England needed women's labor absolutely and feared women's autonomy absolutely. And the collision of those two facts produced something quite deliberate. Women brewed ale, not occasionally, overwhelmingly. The alewife was one of the most common figures in medieval English commercial life. A woman producing and selling ale from her home or her small shop, identifiable by the ale stake above her door. Brewing at this scale was small, domestic, manageable, and women owned it entirely. They also dominated the silk trade in London, supplying goods sophisticated enough for the royal court. They spun, wove, and sold. They worked as hucksters and regraitresses, small-scale traders buying and reselling goods in the market spaces that the formal guild system had not yet fully claimed. And then watch what happens. Watch the pattern. As brewing expanded into a genuinely profitable commercial enterprise across the 14th and 15th centuries, men moved in. Guild regulations tightened. Licensing requirements appeared that were applied selectively and capriciously to female traders. The cultural machinery shifted. The alewife became a caricature, hook-nosed, dishonest, associated with the devil, a figure of mockery and suspicion in sermons, in plays, in popular imagery. A deliberate, sustained campaign of reputation destruction so effective that the image persisted for centuries. The London silkwomen petitioned Parliament directly in the 15th century. Formal, articulate, evidence petitions arguing against the flooding of their market with foreign imports that was destroying their livelihoods. Parliament listened politely and did nothing. This is the pattern that repeats across the medieval centuries with a consistency that cannot be coincidence. When a trade is small and the income modest, women do it. When it grows into something genuinely profitable, the walls appear. The guild raises its barriers. The church adds its moral gloss. The law discovers a technicality. And the women who built the trade find themselves standing outside it, looking in at something they created. You are living inside a system that requires your labor and works simultaneously and continuously to prevent that labor from translating into independence. And yet, the most important two words in this entire story. And yet you did not simply absorb the weight and disappear into it. Medieval women built structures of survival that operated entirely outside official systems because they had to. Informal credit networks ran through communities like underground rivers, neighbors lending to neighbors, women extending trust through relationships that the formal credit market never reached. Food and childcare were shared during illness and crisis with a coordination that no lord or guild organized. The manorial court records, when historians read them carefully enough, show women arguing cases, defending property, negotiating agreements, speaking with a directness and confidence that the doctrine of coverture would suggest was impossible. They found every crack in every wall, and they moved through them with extraordinary persistence. The midwives deserve more than a footnote. These women, practicing without license, without legal protection, without any official recognition of their expertise, maintained a medical tradition of genuine sophistication across centuries. They attended every birth, sat with every dying woman, managed the intersection of medicine and community in ways that no university-trained physician ever approached. Their knowledge was called superstition by men who knew considerably less. It survived anyway, because survival demanded it survive, passed from woman to woman in hushed voices across the generations like something too valuable and too fragile to be written down. What medieval women leave behind is not a record of suffering alone. It is a record of relentless, largely unacknowledged competence, of people handed impossible conditions and responding with a collective ingenuity that no one thought to document, because it never occurred to anyone that ordinary endurance was worth preserving. We look back at medieval England, and we see the cathedrals and the chronicles and the kings with their wars and their treaties. We do not, as a habit, see the women who fed those households, managed those economies, and held those communities together through every plague and famine and devastating winter that history threw at them. That invisibility was not an accident. It was constructed carefully from the beginning. But the evidence is there in the court rolls and the guild records and the wills and the petitions, in the small, stubborn traces of lives that refuse to remain entirely silent. If this world of medieval survival holds you, the next chapter is already waiting. We have spoken about the daily weight of ordinary life, but there is a specific season in medieval England when ordinary life collapses entirely, when the harvest fails and the roads empty and the desperation that was always underneath the surface finally breaks through. That story is coming, and what people were forced to do to survive, it will make everything you have just heard feel almost bearable. Stay close. If this reached something in you, leave a comment. These are the stories history left behind on purpose. It matters that someone is still looking for them.